we can get your introduction in the recording. So, hi everybody, welcome. This is our second virtual coffee hour for the semester, and one of the things we wanted to do was profile PhD students, recent grads, folks on the market, so that we could, really get a sense of what you all are working on and promote your research. And so, Berenike Firestone is with us, who graduated very recently with your PhD from Columbia. So I'll just briefly read Dr. Firestone's bio. So Berenike Firestone is a political and comparative historical sociologist. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the Berlin Social Science Center, working in the Transformations of Democracy Research Department. She received her PhD in sociology from Columbia last year. Broadly, Berenike's research is about far-right politics and support for pluralistic democracy and the ways in which history and memory shape both of these things. She uses a variety of methods, including experiments, statistical analysis of observational data, and in-depth qualitative analysis of archival data, and likes to do work that crosses disciplinary boundaries, which is awesome. So welcome so much, Berenike, and I will pass the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Anjuli. I'm really excited to present some of my work here, and very much looking forward to your comments and questions later. So today I'm presenting work that is co-authored with two co-authors. One, Ruth Dittelmann, is a social psychologist and a professor here in Berlin at the Hertie School. And the other is Ozan Tokolu. He's a political scientist, a postdoc at the Hertie School, and an incoming assistant professor at Trinity College Dublin. So we come from three different disciplines, and I think you'll probably notice that a bit. So I'm presenting a paper that is titled "Participating in a Digital History Project Mobilizes People for Symbolic Justice and Better Intergroup Relations Today." And it's not moving forward. Ah, it is, okay. It's not on my screen, 1 second. Okay. So sorry about that. So just a quick note that this paper is forthcoming in Psychological Science, and we just got the proof, so we're very excited and hopeful that it will be online any day. So then you can actually read the full thing. It's going to be open access, so it should be available to anyone. And it's part of a larger research project, and this larger project is about collective remembrance projects. So these are projects that are often initiated by civil society, and they allow people to contribute to collective memory of historical atrocities and injustice. And so here you see some examples, and you might be familiar with some of them. On the left, you see a so-called stumbling stone. These are local memorials to victims of Nazi persecution. The memorial started in Germany, but it's now all over Europe. And here you see a stumbling stone for Hermann Jax, and these stones are placed in front of the last freely chosen place of residence of a person, and then they note what happened to them or what was done to them. So in this case, Hermann Jax was deported and then murdered. There are also stumbling stones for people who went into exile, for example. And this has inspired, in the middle, you see witness stones in Connecticut. So these are similar stones that commemorate people who were enslaved. So in this case, somebody called Tomé. And then on the right, you see a project that you may also know, I'm not sure, Sundown Towns. It's about towns in the US where Black people were forced to leave before sundown. And so it's often not known history. And so this project encourages people to research the history of their own towns and then contribute to an online map and resource. And so these collective remembrance projects, they typically have two kinds of objectives. So the first one is symbolic justice. So they typically seek in some shape or form to restore justice symbolically, for example, by honoring the victims, by keeping their memory alive, and also simply by acknowledging the injustice that was done. Another set of objectives relate to what we call prevention. So they seek to build societies, communities that are resilient against these types of atrocities in the future, this type of injustice. So this can take different forms. For example, they might seek to mobilize people for democracy, for a pluralistic society, or also specifically improve attitudes towards minoritized groups or groups that were persecuted. And the questions that have been guiding us are what forms and formats of remembrance actually lead to positive intergroup outcomes, because there's such a plethora of different formats. Do they mostly promote the symbolic justice objectives or the prevention objectives, or both? And which mechanisms make them effective? And so the backdrop to this is that there's very much mixed evidence in past research about the effect that exposing people to information about historical atrocities and injustice can have. And so especially members of the majority groups, or of the groups that perpetrated the violence, or descendants of those who perpetrated the violence. So there is some literature suggesting positive outcomes. There's some studies here in the citations that you see that, for example, look at the impact of certain museums, of critical history education, of certain memorials on increased acknowledgement and also improved attitudes and behaviors. But there's also a quite substantial literature suggesting that what you see is a lot of defensiveness and sometimes even backlash among the majority group to this information, or to initiatives that seek to make it more visible, especially from the social psychology literature. And something that's been happening a lot in museums and memorials and in the education space in general is an increase in participatory formats. And so we're wondering if maybe participatory formats can be one way to help overcome this defensiveness and actually motivate people, also of the majority group, or of the group that was implicated in the injustice, to become engaged. So what we did was study the impact of a real-world project. It's called Every Name Counts, and it's a project by the Arelson Archives. The Arelson Archives are the largest archive on Nazi persecution in the world. They're based in the geographic center of Germany, a tiny, tiny town in really in the middle of Germany, that was selected by the Allies after 45, after they had liberated the concentration camps, to bring all original documents to this one central location, so that relatives could search for their relatives and try to find out if they were possibly still alive, if not, where they may have been murdered, etc. So it was really a tracing service in the beginning. And so they have around 30 million documents, many from concentration camps, some also from forced labor camps, and later from displaced person camps. And so what they ended up doing is deciding to digitize the entire archive, which is massive. And to do it, they decided to crowdsource this task. And so what this looks like is, when the format has slightly changed, the interface has changed since we did the study, but this is what it looked like when we studied it. You would log in and you would see an original scan on the left. So here you see a so-called prisoner registration card of Josef Sved. This is a card that the SS would fill out when people who were captured or deported, brought to the concentration camps, would enter the concentration camp. And you see how meticulous they would, write down all the information. So it always has the name of the person. It always, on the top left, you see the P has the assigned category of, so essentially the victim group that the Nazis assigned. So in this case, P is for Polish. And then it has some personal information, like whether they were married, had kids, their address. This part differs a little bit from one card to the next. And then here you see the red line, which means that the person was murdered. And so then what you do if you participate in Every Name Counts, on the right, you essentially do a data entry. So you put in this case, the birth date. And this helps to digitize the archive so that, for example, relatives today or descendants who live outside of Germany, they can find out information about their ancestors, for example. That's one goal, is to make that more easily possible, and also to make sure that these records remain and the names are remembered. So this really took off during the pandemic. The project started just before, and then during the lockdown, many people participated, but it continues to go on, and over 7 million documents have been digitized this way, and over 250,000 volunteers have participated, also not just from Germany, but globally, many from the US, some also from Latin America. So how did we approach this research? we decided to collaborate with a civil society partner, in this case, the Erlandson Archive, and to do this jointly. So this started in 2021. And then we spent about a year and jointly identifying the goals, which we can talk about in the Q&A if you're interested in doing this type of research. So this involved both identifying together what the goals of every name counts are beyond digitizing the archive, but there were some very broad goals around, for example, increasing respect. So what does that mean and how would we measure that in a study? And then also to, as we did these studies, to always share our results and discuss what they meant for their programs. And also to balance kind of scientific rigor, for example, the need to randomize for an experiment and have large enough samples, and practical needs of the organization. So in terms of the research design, we did 3 things. We started with a user survey where we surveyed around 700 volunteers that were already participating in Every Name Counts, and had lots of open-ended questions. And really what we wanted to know is, what is this experience like for them? And it would help us potentially identify the mechanism that might make this project effective. Then we did a lab experiment in a physical lab here in Berlin with university students to really kind of causally test the effect of the project and to isolate the mechanism. And then we did what we ended up calling an online RCT, and we went back and forth about this a long time, so we can talk about that too, the Q&A. And the sample had digital workers, 900, and we were able to survey them again after 2 weeks. So this way we could also look at any impact after, not just immediately after participating. So for the mechanism, here's a quote from the survey where a volunteer wrote, "Working together from a distance with a common purpose, I felt that we can make something big, useful, worth standing. We can build and care for a memory for those people we must never forget." And this is just one of many quotes, and many said something along the lines of, even if I just digitize one card, I feel like I've done something useful, I've contributed to this bigger goal. And so in social psychology, there is a concept called participative efficacy, which is the belief that my individual contribution matters for a collective goal. So you're probably familiar with self-efficacy, right? That what I do matters. So for little kids, my son is 2, right? The light switch is very interesting because you switch it and the light goes on and you realize you did something. And so then with group activities, something like big protests, for example, there's sometimes the question of, well, why would people even participate, right? There's almost like a collective action problem with if you believe the group can do something, but what does your contribution matter? And so this tries to capture this in between, where it's that your contribution matters to a collective goal that you do as part of a group. And in this literature on efficacy, the idea is that if you successfully perform a behavior, then it increases your efficacy beliefs, your belief that what you do matters and that you can do it. And then it also increases your intentions for future similar behavior. So you're more likely to then also engage in that behavior. And so in the lab experiment, we wanted to really isolate the effect of participation of this larger project. We had these 550 German university students. It was a between subjects design with a pretest. And the treatment was the following. So in the treatment condition, people watched about 3-minute instructional video. And then they indexed original prisoner registration cards from Buchenwald, so one of the larger concentration camps, for 15 to 20 minutes. And we did it in this order because at the time, this would be the flow on the website. So if you joined the project, you would watch this video and then index these cards. In the control condition, we call it information-only condition. We wanted to have something that was as similar as possible without the participation aspect. So they read a text about Nazi persecution, about these cards, and also about the Erlandson archives. And they also saw 2 sample prisoner registration cards. So very similar information, but no information about this crowdsourcing project, and also no ability to participate in it. In terms of the outcomes, And this goes back a little bit to what I said about this process of working together with the archives. I'm going to show you some quotes actually from a flyer from Every Name Counts, and you will see this twofold goal of symbolic justice and prevention. So in this flyer, for example, it says, we launched this project, tens of thousands of volunteers have contributed. And then this last bit, thanks to their efforts, future generations will be able to remember the victims' names and identities, right? And so this is part of the idea to keep the memory of the victims alive. Then there's the second part, which is, you see here in the slogan, stand up for respect, diversity, and democracy. And then this part of the text where it says, Every Name Counts always links the past to the present because the documents show what anti-Semitism, racism, and discrimination can lead to. Everyone who takes part in Every Name Counts is standing up for the memory of the victims of Nazi persecution and for a pluralistic, open society today. So this clearly has this kind of prevention goal in mind. And so the way we measured it was for symbolic justice, we had several items about collective action intentions for commemoration. So how motivated people said they were to, for example, commemorate the victims of Nazi persecution in physical space. It says physical space because we also asked about the digital space since this was a digital intervention. We also asked them to allocate donations. So we had 100 euros. And every person could allocate them between 4 organizations: memorials, site at a concentration camp, a anti-racism organization, an environmental organization, and an arts foundation. And these are all real organizations that we then actually donated the money to. For prevention objectives, we asked about collective action intentions for democracy, for better intergroup relations. So for example, an item would be something like, how likely are you to sign petitions against anti-democratic movements or parties? And then with the donation allocation, they could allocate donations to this anti-racism foundation. And then we also had some prejudice items, for example, a feeling thermometer, some of you might know, where you're asked how warm or cold do you feel towards a group. And so we asked feeling thermometer towards Jews, Roma and Sinti, another big, large victim group of the Nazis, and then refugees and Turkish Germans, who are 2 of the main kind of predominantly discriminated groups today in Germany. And so for the hypotheses, and I'll keep this a little short, but essentially we expected positive effects across the board. So we expected positive effects on symbolic justice outcomes so that they would be more motivated to engage in these actions compared to just receiving the information, also more motivated for collective action tensions for democracy, reduce prejudice. And in terms of the mechanism, this we measured participative efficacy. We also measured a few other mechanisms from the literature, like social norms, collective guilt, and we expected that participation would increase participative efficacy. So here are the results from the lab experiment. These are standard deviations, and so these are comparing those who randomly were assigned to participate in Every Name Counts to those who were in the control condition. And so you see a fairly large effect on collective action intentions for commemoration, and also a small effect on the donation allocation to a memorial site. And then for collective action in support of a democratic pluralistic society, we see a positive effect, but it's at the edge of significance. Nothing on prejudice, no increase in the donation for the anti-racism foundation. And then again, a quite large effect on participative efficacy. And so then, of course, we wondered, well, first of all, these are university students. We wanted to do it in a physical lab because we weren't sure that if we do it online, people would actually digitize. And we wanted to have a study where we are in the space and we can see that people are really digitizing. But since these were students, they are younger, more educated, more left-leaning. And because of our setup with this control condition that was so similar to the treatment condition purposefully to look at the effect of participation, we didn't know what the overall effect of just participating was to not doing anything. And so we decided to do an online study and really quantify this overall effect and also be able to ask again after 2 to 3 weeks. which it says longer term. For these kinds of studies, this is longer term, right? So most of them don't even measure it one day after. I mean, I sometimes wonder, well, what's the effect after, 3 months? But we don't know. But this is a start. So 900 digital workers participated through a platform called ClickWorker. So they tend to do like online tasks. We again had a between subjects design, and the second assessment or the invitation to fill out the questionnaire was 2 weeks later, and then they had a week to fill it out. So that's why it ends up being 2 to 3 weeks later. And so the treatment was the exact same as in the lab study. They watched the video and then indexed for 15 to 20 minutes, also from the same archival collection from the Buchenwald concentration camp. But in the control condition, they didn't do anything. They went straight to the outcome questionnaire. We also added some additional outcomes. So for symbolic justice, we added a question about collective action intentions for the commemoration, of German colonial crimes. So this is because in the first study, we saw this large effect on collective action intentions for commemoration. And we were curious if we would also see this if the case is not directly related to the project they're participating in. And for prevention, we specifically added questions about anti-Semitism, because in the lab study, it was the part about kind of a democratic, pluralistic society had mixed questions, some about anti-Semitism, some about discrimination in general. So we created a whole index only on action intentions against anti-Semitism. The hypotheses were essentially the same as in the lab study. We expected positive effects and again, an increase in participative efficacy. And here are the results from the, like immediately after. So people participated, then filled out the questionnaire. And so we see quite a large effect, actually very large effect, half a standard deviation on action intentions for commemorating the Holocaust, and also a fairly large effect on collective action intentions to commemorate victims of German colonialism. We see a smaller effect, but positive collective action intentions for democratic society, a larger one for anti-Semitism, so action against anti-Semitism. Again, a null effect for prejudice, and then a very large effect again for participative efficacy. So this seemed to confirm our findings from the lab study and added a little more information because we could add these additional items. 2 weeks later, there were some behavioral measures we added. So people could again donate. That was the same one as in round one. And then they could also write a letter to the president to ask him to protect memorial sites from vandalism. And we collected these texts and sent them to the president. And then they could click on a link to receive information about other memory projects and share information about Every Name Counts on social media. So for 2 weeks later, when we resurveyed the people who had participated 2 weeks before, we see that the action intentions for commemoration, both for victims of the Holocaust and victims of colonialism, remained and actually remained fairly large. So that's quite promising. The donation one was no longer significant, the donation outcome. Collective action for democracy, also no longer significant. Anti-Semitism was still significant, but especially the ones about commemoration remained large. In terms of the behavioral measures, none of them were significant. And so what we don't know is, were they just not like there was no effect on them? That's one interpretation. The other interpretation, because we only measured them 2 weeks later, is there could have been an effect immediately after participating, but it was no longer there 2 weeks later. We purposefully didn't ask these questions right after participating because the people in the control condition hadn't had any opportunity to do anything, right? Because they were not part of the Every Name Counts group. So we didn't want to give them an opportunity to become involved, to learn about Every Name Counts, because then if we measured 2 weeks later, it may not actually be a control condition in that sense, right? So that's why we couldn't ask them before. So in terms of takeaways, One is that the studies show that participation really motivates people to take action. So there's potentially this virtuous cycle of participating in one project and then being more interested in doing more. The aspect of participative efficacy being apparently quite crucial for achieving these objectives of symbolic justice and prevention. And then that we see these improved action intentions, but actually no prejudice reduction. And this is in line with a lot of studies that show that it's easier to change behavior than it is to change attitudes. And so in a way, the hope is that by having people, adjust their behavior, change their behavior, that can eventually lead to changed attitudes, but it's unclear if that's really happening. And then one thing that I found especially interesting actually was this spillover, so to say, from one case, so Nazi persecution and the Holocaust, to another, colonialism. And some of you might be familiar with these debates, but especially in the German context, they're very hot debates about the commemoration of German colonial crimes. And there are some people who argue that it's a zero-sum game, essentially. So if you devote more attention to one past injustice, it takes away from the other. So there's some kind of competition between colonial memory and Holocaust memory. And then there are others like Michael Rothberg who argue that it's actually very fruitful to engage in what he calls multidirectional memory, which, connects different memories and, kind of sees it as generative. And so I think this finding makes me hopeful that that might be happening. And then I have some points, really, especially for the Q&A, if some of you are interested in discussing them. One is for these prevention goals, the connection that we make or that people make between the past and then the present, we believe depends quite a lot on societal framing. So in terms of this efficacy literature, we know that what they call spillover typically occurs to conceptually related domains. So if you have a successful performance behavior in behavior one, for example, you overcome your fear of spiders by interacting with them, you're also more likely to then be less afraid or interact more with other animals, for example, right? So they're conceptually related. But of course, in this case, in terms of dealing with past atrocities, the question is, what is conceptually related? And so in the case of the Holocaust and Holocaust memory, there is a strong link that's often made to human rights and fights against anti-Semitism. And there's some critical work on this, including by Leah David, who was here last month, and also Katrin Antweiler on this link that is often made between Holocaust memory and human rights today. So we can talk about that more. It's something that kind of is on my mind and I'm curious about. And then there are also ethical challenges, of course, of working with conflict archives. So I think it's very promising that we see all these positive effects with the Every Name Counts project. I also don't think that means that everybody should now start involving everyone in digitizing all the conflict archives or something, because conflict archives, of course, one, they come from the perspective of the perpetrators. So these documents you saw are documents by the SS, right, about people, and they have the information that the SS decided was relevant information to put on them, for example. There is this concern that if you have files and files and files, it could dehumanize people. This project aims to go against that by emphasizing the importance of the names, but you actually get not so much personal information about people. So there are all these ethical challenges that we can talk about. And Ruth and I have actually written a piece in German, and we're hoping to translate it into English about all the normative decisions we've made in this research program on doing this kind of quantitative empirical work on Holocaust remembrance projects, from the outcomes we choose to study to the projects we study, etc., and trying to show that, especially in that field where some people with kind of quantitative approaches sometimes suggest it would be better to be neutral or objective, to show that that is really hardly possible, and that it's better to just be transparent about the normative choices you make in your research process. So we're hoping to encourage people to do that. And that's it for now. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the Q&A.